Okay. All right, so today, before we start with today's material, I want to pick up on something we talked about last Tuesday, on the culture of poverty and Sarban's model of poverty. And he talks about how people that develop a kind of degraded sense of self-identity, particularly if they're financially impoverished, are typically confined to ascribed or birth-related statuses. They don't have enough access to achieve statuses. So we're going to show you a really interesting example of somebody trying to provide a program that brings financially impoverished people into ascribed statuses. And this is somebody who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to develop this microcredit program in Bangladesh. So Muhammad Yunus.
From ABC News headquarters, this is World News with Charles Gibson.
Welcome to World News. Tonight, highest honors to a man who helped millions rise from poverty with just a small helping hand. Good evening. We begin tonight with high honor and total disgrace. In democracies around the world, people are elected to serve the public good. Tonight, a man who held no office, yet helped more families than most politicians ever do, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And another man who was voted often into the U.S. Congress is leaving a convicted criminal, part of a bribery scandal. We cover both and begin with the honored, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Muhammad Yunus. ABC's Mark Litke has followed his story for years.
Walk with Muhammad Yunus through a rural Bangladeshi village as I did, and you'll know you're in the presence of someone quite special. A humble revolutionary, really, responsible for lifting millions of his countrymen and women out of abject poverty. The first Bangladeshi to win a Nobel Prize, he was characteristically more excited for his country and others who might benefit.
We all very excited about the good news. It excites everybody in Bangladesh and also the people who are involved in microcredit around the world.
Microcredit, a profoundly simple idea. Yunus founded the Grameen Bank to carry out his vision for ending poverty. Lend money to tens of millions of Bangladeshis who have absolutely nothing. His first loan, $27 out of his own pocket. Give them the chance to start a small business, he says, raising livestock, weaving baskets, operating a mobile phone service in their remote villages. They need no collateral.
The fact that you're a human being, that's a good enough introduction for us.
Grameen now has more than 6 million borrowers. Average loan, $130, and most go to women. In a conservative Muslim country where women traditionally had very little influence, Yunus believes that women more than men use the loans in ways that help entire communities. 99% of all Grameen loans are paid back in full. Yunus is not surprised that microloans have caught on worldwide, that some of the largest financial institutions now have millions in microloans on their books.
You've let the genie out of a bottle. That's the word, genie out of the bottle. That's what you're really trying to do. Take the genie out of the bottle.
That genie will now deliver $1.4 million in Nobel Prize money, and Yunus says all of it will be put to use for those who need it most in Bangladesh. Mark Litke, ABC News.
Microcredit now makes loans in 131 countries. Yunus says he's going to use his Nobel Prize money to start a company that will make low-cost, high-nutrition food for the poor and to build an eye hospital in his native Bangladesh.
So this program that Muhammad Yunus created in Bangladesh has been replicated and spread throughout the world, and it's become an extremely important social intervention. You know, last week we were talking about changing environments and changing people's welfare and well-being through social intervention. So that's a good example of a social intervention that took a lot of people who were financially poor and brought them into these business-related achieved roles. And so not just their ascribed roles that they were sort of locked into before he started this program, but the kind of new entrepreneurial roles that he created for them. Now, today we're going to talk some about the evaluation of environmental interventions. And this is a very important topic because there are a lot of reasons why we might want to evaluate the effects of the environment on people and also the effects or outcomes of our policies as we implement them based on our research. So there are different types of research to evaluate the relationships between people and environments. So we've got descriptive research, which is essentially observing what's happening out there. So one could go around LA and take a look at where airports are located and the extent to which schools are located under the flight path, and you find that they tend to be in low-income minority neighborhoods. And that simple observational step that was taken by Bullard in Atlanta led to his more extensive research on environmental justice, environmental racism. So that's description, just going out and describing what's there. And then we have experimental designs, and you can distinguish between true experiments, which involve random assignment of people to different conditions, and quasi-experiments where the people aren't randomly assigned. So can you think of any examples of a true and a quasi-experiment that we've talked about in this class? Can anybody think of something that represents either a true or a quasi-experiment? So the true experiment is where you have very rigorous random assignment of people to the different conditions. They're not just self-selected into the conditions, but the experimenter randomly assigns them. And that's important for a lot of reasons, because it tends to compensate for individual differences. So everybody has an equal chance of being in one or the other conditions, and that way you minimize the effect of these individual differences on the outcomes. So Amber. William White. Well, William White was actually an observational study. He wasn't really creating control groups and treatment groups, but he was just observing how people behave in a public space. So that's a good example of a kind of a straight observational study, which is very useful. What about quasi or true experiments, Aisha? So that's a good example where Schultz randomly assigned the people living in that residential facility to the different visitation groups, controllable visits, predictable, random visits, or no visits. So they were randomly assigned to those different conditions. It was done in the field, it wasn't done in a laboratory, but that's a good example of a true experiment. Yeah, excellent. So to the extent that we're comparing people that live under the flight path, let's say kids going to school in a noisy school in Los Angeles, compared to children who are from similar socioeconomic background, but they're living or going to school in a quieter zone, that's not a random assignment. We can't tell people, okay, live here or live there. Those families have self-selected into those neighborhoods. But now we've got at least a basis for comparing their outcomes, and what we try to do is statistically control for potential confounds or differences that might explain the treatment effects between the noise and the quiet zone. So that is a good example of a quasi-experiment. We're also going to talk about different criteria for judging the quality of research. We're going to come back to the idea of validity, internal validity, external validity, and also scientific validity versus social validity. We can have high scientific validity, like the study designed to get people to ride the bus at Penn State. So they were able to show that the X variable, reinforcing people, had a big impact on their bus ridership behavior during the treatment phase. But was that experiment socially valid? That is, the fact that they moved the walkers onto the bus rather than influencing anything about the car drivers, you have to question, well, was that a socially valid study in the sense of what can you do with those findings? Do you want to move walkers onto buses, or do you want to try to target the car drivers more effectively? So we'll take a look in the Campbell article that's assigned for today we'll look at how he suggests different strategies for evaluating environmental policies and interventions. And that's very important because a lot of our policies and programs that our Congress passes and puts into effect are never evaluated. So we don't know whether the drug abuse resistance program, when it first went into effect, nobody knew that it was going to be kind of a flop. It wasn't very effective. And through later evaluations of that program, we found that it wasn't getting the job done. It wasn't accomplishing what the goals of that program were. So those are some of the issues we're going to be talking about. Why should we evaluate? So in the next slide, we see some of the reasons why, some of the examples we've talked about during the quarter. Why spend time and money to go about evaluating effects of environments on people or the outcomes of our policies? So if we hadn't done this research, for example, the research by Glass and Singer and others to study how children respond to traffic noise in these high-rise apartment buildings in New York, we never would have known that that's having very tangible effects on their academic achievements, their auditory discrimination, and a number of other outcomes. Just as if we hadn't done the research on children going to school under the flight path of a noisy airport, we wouldn't know that their blood pressure goes up. And that has implications for hypertension later in life. Or the effects of window views on surgery recovery. Or how sprawl is related to the obesity epidemic, urban sprawl. Or whether we should put money into certain kinds of decorations or decor in an elderly facility to enhance or bring about certain positive social behaviors. Should we put money into a program that brings architectural insulation, sound insulation to those schools? Will that dampen those blood pressure effects? So these are all questions that sort of cry out for some evaluation so we know, whether this is a good use of our resources or not. So descriptive research, as I said, is probably the simplest approach in where basically the experimenter, or not the experimenter, but the researcher who's observing goes around to different settings and observes what's happening there. So you're not trying to assign people to control groups and treatment groups, but you're just trying to see what's going on. It's more of an exploratory, early kind of investigation. So in the next slide, you can see one of the studies we talked about, Roger Barker, who came up with the idea of behavior settings. And one of his books was based on following this boy around for 24 hours and recording what settings he went into, how his behavior changed as a function of these different settings. And that's where his theory of behavior settings really emanated from that descriptive research. So descriptive research can be pretty valuable and generative for subsequent kinds of research. Now, in the field of biology, we know that Darwin's work on going out in the Galapagos Islands and observing different species and classifying them in different phyla, that was descriptive research. It wasn't experimental microbiology, but what his research did is it laid the foundations, his insights, for theory of evolution, natural selection, survival of the fittest, and subsequent experimental research in the biological sciences. So that was a very important foundational piece of research. Here you've got the periodic table. The same kind of thing could be said for chemistry, where the earliest research was really trying to ascertain what are the differences between different atoms and their atomic weights, and when we combine them into molecules, how do they behave? Very descriptive kind of research that led to our current day, very sophisticated physical sciences research, experimental work, and the like. So in the next slide, we've got this difference between true and quasi-experiments. A true experiment involves random assignment of cases to treatment and control groups to assess the effects of treatments on outcome variables. And we do that random assignment, as I said, to dampen the effects of individual differences on the outcomes we're measuring. So, people who have different backgrounds and different characteristics have the same opportunity to wind up in one of the treatment conditions or some other comparison condition. So that's a way of sort of equalizing the field. Quasi-experiments don't have that advantage, but sometimes they're the best we can do when we want to find out if a particular situation is having an effect, and we can't randomly assign people to live in a noisy neighborhood or a quiet neighborhood. We still want to do those comparisons and try to control for confounding variables to see what those impacts are. So quasi-experiments are extremely important in our field because a lot of times we're looking at people living in environments where they've self-selected into them. We can't randomly assign them to experimental conditions. So we talked about examples of quasi and true experiments in environmental psychology. And here are 4 examples that we've talked about earlier in the quarter. Under true experiments, you have the Glass and Singer's laboratory studies where they randomly assign people to predictable versus controllable noise. And they found the different after effects that occurs when you're exposed to unpredictable noise versus predictable, and the same for controllable and uncontrollable. When people had the option to push that panic button and turn off the noise, even if they didn't push the button, their negative after effects were dampened. They were not as severe as people that didn't have the perception of control over that noise. So that was a randomized true experimental study. The Matthew and Cannon study of people walking by a noisy lawnmower and deciding whether to help a bystander who has dropped a bunch of books, that's done in a field situation, but it's very clever, true experimental design where, they randomly assigned who would see the person dropping the books with a cast on their arm or who would see somebody without a cast on their arm. So they varied the presentation of that stimulus to each of the pedestrians that came by. Quasi-experiments would be something like Ulrich's study of recovery from surgery in a hospital room that has a view of nature out the window or a view of another building out the window. Those patients were not randomly assigned to those rooms. So he began with what he had there, people assigned to their different rooms, and then he saw that some of the rooms had nature views, some didn't, and that created the basis for a very interesting and provocative study. So it was more of a quasi-experiment rather than random assignment. And then our study of airport noise and the effects on children, as we've said, was not a true experiment. It was a quasi-experiment because we took who was already in place in the noisy and quiet neighborhoods. We tried to match the children and their parents for socioeconomic status, so we were controlling for those variables. And then we looked at our outcomes like blood pressure and academic achievement and things like that. So those are examples of these different types we're talking about. Now let's take a look at something that's near and dear to our hearts, and that is our ability to attend to information. So we saw this study last week. You know, you're in a classroom here, you want to get as much information as you can, you want to absorb it. And this very interesting study was done at Western Washington University by Hyman, Voss, Wise et al. And you saw the video of this where basically they observed students walking through the central red square, they call it, at Western Washington University. And as they passed through, and something like 172 students total, they identified those who were talking on their cell phones in a conversation, those who were not using any kind of electronics, and those who were walking in pairs with a friend, those who were walking by themselves but listening to music on an iPod or something like that, but not talking in a conversation. And they found that this intentional blindness while walking and talking on a cell phone was much greater for the cell phone users. So you can see that only 25% of the people in that condition said that they even saw the clown, the unicycling clown. So 75% of the cell phone users on a conversation with someone else in a different location missed that cue. Whereas the people who were walking through by themselves without any electronics were twice as likely, more than half as likely, to spot the unicycling clown. So if people can be that oblivious to information just by walking through an environment, what about when you're in a classroom and you're taking a course and you're studying for exams and you want to retain that information? What's the effect of texting and using your laptop during a classroom? And we said that in this class, we had an open policy on that. It was your choice in terms of whether you want to use your electronics here or not, as long as you're not disrupting anybody. So in the next slide, you can see one of those, a very interesting study. Well, actually, this is just a pictorial showing you what it sometimes looks like to us as professors, sort of gazing up at a classroom and all the sea of computers out there and people on their phones. But in the next slide, this study was done at Butler University, and that's in Indiana. And they did an interesting sort of random assignment of people taking a course, and those who had cell phones, they had text messaging plans. So they randomly divided them up into two groups. And for the people who were going to be using their cell phone during the lecture, they gave them the cell phone number of somebody else in the class. So during the lecture, they were engaged in a conversation both with the person whose number they received and then somebody else calling into them who's had received their number. So you got a couple of conversations going at one time. And then they gave them a quiz on the lecture material, and there were something like 6 multiple choice items. And you can see the difference there between about 60% retention or accuracy in the texting condition versus the no texting condition. So again, this is a kind of true experimental design where people are being randomly assigned to these different conditions. Now in this study, and this was done at Cornell University, there were about 44 students taking this class, and throughout the quarter or semester at Cornell, they had been encouraged to be able to use their laptops and their electronics. But they decided to test whether using those electronics had any effect on recall and recollection or recognition of material from the class, from a lecture. So they randomly sent half of the students out to another room for a different kind of activity and had the students remaining in the room free to use their laptops, and they were on their laptops during the lecture. And then they traded places. So the students who were in the room listening to the lecture at first with their laptops open then went to this other place, and then the students who were in the other location came into the lecture hall, and they were told not to use their laptops, keep them closed. So what did they find? Well, they had 20 measures, and 10 of the measures were multiple choice, and when you see this pointer isn't working as well as I'd like, but the recall measure is for short answer items. So half of the questions were short answer. Write something about the lecture that they're asking you. That's a much harder thing to do. So you can see that where you have those open-ended items, both groups are doing worse on those as compared to these recognition multiple choice, because a multiple choice item, the options in a multiple choice, cues you into something and you can recognize it better. And then the total score is this medium shade column here, which combines over recall and recognition, so the multiple choice and the short answer. And what you see is for the closed laptop group, their accuracy here on the quiz was about 64 or 63% for the total score, whereas for the open laptop condition, it was more around 55. And then you can see it's even more of a gap here in terms of the recall when you're asking somebody short answer. So I give you this just for food for thought. We all think that we're pretty good multitaskers. I certainly think I multitask as much as anybody. But there are some deficits that occur from this division of attention, divided attention, or fragmented attention. And in some environments, that could be a lot more serious, obviously, if you're driving. Or if you're walking, talking on a cell phone, and you're kind of weaving and you bump into, you crash into somebody or somebody crashes into you who's on their bike. And this can happen out on our ring road here at UCI. They've got pretty strict rules about, where people can ride their bikes here. But there is this kind of effect of not being able to track multiple sources of information at the same time. So a lot of us assume we can sit in a lecture or some kind of presentation and soak it all up and still be on some virtual site. But these studies suggest that, well, that's not necessarily the case. Amber's asking if anybody has studied the effects of taking notes on a computer versus handwritten. Right? I'm not sure. There probably is, but I'm not aware of it. Any questions about these studies? So these are some examples of experiments, random assignment to these different conditions. And they're, as I said, they're a topic that's of interest to all of us because we're all sort of struggling with, how do we sift through and retain information effectively and also stay out of trouble when we're walking or driving. So it's important to be aware of some of these findings. So when we do research in applied settings, like, going into an out-of-court settlement study in Los Angeles where the school board is suing the airport for the noise effects on the children that are going to school under the flight path, that's an applied setting. And we were called in to try to study that phenomenon. And a true experiment wasn't possible in that situation. We couldn't randomly assign people to those living conditions or school conditions. But we still need to assess whether an independent variable, i.e. airplane noise, is having an effect on blood pressure, academic performance, or some other outcome. So we can ask, for example, does the 3 strikes law in California reduce crime? That's an applied issue. It's a policy evaluation issue. That's very important. We need to know whether our policies are having the intended effects. Does the drug abuse and resistance education program work to reduce adolescent substance abuse? And we know from study after study that it's not effective. So that's why we want to do these evaluations, to find out if we're pouring money into programs that don't work or are not effective, or maybe they're having unintended negative effects quite apart from what we anticipated. Do noise abatement programs in elementary schools located near airports improve the health and educational outcomes of students? And that's something that we did evaluate in that study where we observed the students and their blood pressures in the spring. Then the school board brought in the architectural attenuation. In the summer, they modified the roofs of those classrooms and school buildings. And then we went back in the fall and retested to see if in the schools that were attenuated, there was a dampening of blood pressure effects. And we did find some positive effect of that architectural intervention. Now, the paper by Campbell, and It looks kind of daunting because it's pretty long, and I've actually only assigned the part that goes up to the control series design, not the whole article. But I assigned it because it makes some really important points by a person who is probably the leading methodologist in behavioral and social sciences in the U.S., Don Campbell. He has passed away. He had a huge impact on so many different fields because of his innovations. He came up with the idea of this quasi-experimental design, for example, and wrote a book about that, as I showed you before. But he talks about two kinds of administrators. The trapped administrator, who's politically dependent on having their program look good. They want to get reelected, so they want good outcomes for their program. They want to make it look good through statistics. And, they say sometimes statistics can lie, and you can create graphs and, manipulate data in ways that make your program look good. The other kind of administrator he calls experimental administrators. These are people who are committed to knowing whether, in fact, the program works well or doesn't. And if it's not working well, let's go on, either fix it or go on to something better that is more efficacious. So they're less trapped by these experimental considerations. And they're probably in the minority because most elected officials are embedded in political pressures where they want to look good. They want their programs to look like they're working and they're successful. Now, I mentioned this other distinction, and it's a way of evaluating the quality of research. Scientific validity versus social validity. So scientific validity are the criteria that we all know about in terms of internal validity. Does the X variable really change the Y variable? Or external validity. Can we generalize the findings from a study to some other set of populations and environments? So those are our traditional scientific criteria for the rigor and adequacy of the research. Social validity is more about the social value of the research. We can put money into all kinds of different research, and some of it may be trivial and not have any betterment to society, and other lines of research may be really important, generative, and worth the investment. So the social value, the societal validity or social validity, is just as important in many ways as the scientific validity. They do depend on each other because if you publish a study and the results are not accurate, you have unreliable measures or you have low internal validity in your study conditions, then that you go out with that publication, it's going to have lower social validity because the findings are not accurate the way they're being reported. So they do depend on each other. Social validity does depend on scientific accuracy as a basis or foundation for then doing policy. And that's why we've been talking in the class about using the research in this field of environmental psychology to create environmental design guidelines to make our environments better, to make them more effective. So they're not hurting people, or maybe they're helping people, rise to new levels of higher wellness or creativity, what have you. So the social validity becomes really important. How do we gauge and assess that? Now let's go back to, first of all, just kind of breaking down some of the subcomponents of these. We talked about internal and external validity, construct validity. When I measure somebody's sensation-seeking style or tendency, am I really measuring that, or am I measuring some artifact or something different? That's construct validity. Are our statistics valid when we do our statistical tests? Is the study that we're doing ecologically valid so that it matches sort of what we're going to see in a real environmental situation or societally? Or is it just a contrived experimental situation in a laboratory that doesn't really have much ecological validity or implications for the real world? Now, social validity has these other kind of considerations. Are the effects of a program or an environment prevalent or severe? So if we know that an office is causing people to lose a lot of time because it's noisy or they can't manage privacy, and more than 50% of the workforce is saying that, and they're losing an hour to 2 hours a day, those are high prevalence and severity. And we talked about this earlier when we mentioned the criteria that Brill mentioned or discussed about whether you decide to fix an environmental problem in an office or let it go. Is it worth the investment to fix it? And that depends a lot on whether the effects are negative and prevalent among a lot of the people, a lot of the users or occupants. Is the program or study feasible? Is it cost effective? What's the scope of the impact? Are you having trivial impact on a very few people in society, or are you reaching and benefiting a large number of people? Potential adverse side effects, moving the walkers onto a bus rather than the car drivers. Consistency with community priorities. Sometimes our programs are so 180 degrees opposite to what people want that they don't support them, and the programs are not very effective. And we had this initially with the diamond lanes in California, where people hated that intervention. You had to be ride-sharing with someone in order to go in the fast lane. So people would use inflatable dummies and put them in the passenger seat, so that it looked like they had a passenger in their car. And it was very tense. For a number of years, Californians were resisting. And over time, there was this sort of secular change where people kind of got used to it, dealt with it, and now we don't have that. So priorities can change over time. But when that intervention was first launched, it was not very effective. People were resisting it. So internal validity are the changes in the outcome variable caused by changes in the treatment variable, the X versus the Y. Okay. External validity to what other types of persons, settings, and times, as well as alternate measures of the treatment and outcome variables can the observed effect be generalized. So that's more of a generalizability issue, right? So these are our two scientific criteria that are really important. And then diagrammatically, this is what they look like with the X variable. Does it cause the Y? Versus if you see an effect of X on Y, can you really generalize it reliably to other persons, other settings, other times, and other ways of measuring your variables? So those are two, I'm probably reviewing what a lot of you have had in methodology class already, but I want to do that because Campbell then takes some of those criteria and applies them to a social intervention and an environmental intervention in Connecticut to show how one can use a quasi-experimental design that has sufficient levels of validity, internal validity, to make some conclusions about whether that program was effective or not. So let's take a look at that. First of all, before we go forward, this is from Campbell's article, and I won't read these all. You can do that when you read the article and when you read the slides, but these are some of the different threats to internal validity. So history threat would be something like if you do a crackdown on speeders in a particular state, and the weather that year was particularly dry, not a lot of snow, so there were fewer crashes, then that's a confound because of history. Maturation. We said that in the Schultz study, even though there were differences between the randomly visited and the non-visited groups, and the controllability group and the predictability group, all of those elderly folks over 2 or 3 years declined in zest for life and health status, and that's because they're getting older. Some of those measures are declining naturally. But they still were able to detect the interactions between time and their experimental condition, which was the sort of bottom line important point of the study. But that's what we mean by maturation. People are changing when they're part of an ongoing longitudinal study. Instability, and we'll talk about that with some examples, but instability is the fact that data sets, if you take several different observation points, let's say traffic fatalities in the state of Connecticut from 1951 to 1960, you're going to see a graph that bounces around. It goes up some years, goes down, up, down. And there's a natural instability to any data set. So if you pick the most extreme year where you have the most traffic fatalities, and then you do your crackdown on speeders as your program, and then lo and behold, a year later, you're showing fewer fatalities, that may be because you started at the extreme point where it was the worst it had been. So you have to sort of unpack what that instability is in a data set. If we look at too few data points, we're not going to pick up that instability. Testing effects. Sometimes the effects of taking a test actually changes people's responses to the independent variable over repeated occasions. Instrumentation. Sometimes we change how we measure things. So if in Ribicoff's crackdown on speeders, they changed how they gauge traffic injuries or per capita fatalities, if they were measuring per capita fatalities. And some new census figures came into effect that changed the ratios between the number of people in the state and the number of fatalities. You could see how that would throw off from time 1 to time 2 the reliability of the measurement, because how they're measuring things changed. Regression artifacts is what I just said, picking the most extreme point. Many times people will sign up for a doctor's visit or they'll sign up for psychotherapy, mental health visit. 2/3 of the people on those waiting lists cancel their visits because they sign up for them when they're at their worst, when they are really strung out and they need help. and then they're waiting to get to their appointment the next 2-3 weeks, and they feel better, and they cancel. So that's an example of regression to the mean, that when you're at your worst point or your most extreme point, chances are things are going to go down or get better over time, just statistically. So that's what we mean by regression artifacts. And then you can have invalid selection or biased selection of people into a study where you're maximizing certain kind of characteristics to show a good effect. Experimental mortality is where people are dropping out of some of the conditions of the study in a systematic way, but in a way that's different between the different groups. So it looks like something's happening in one group that's very different from another group. But basically, it's this kind of differential loss of subjects or participants from comparison groups. Now, we're going to take those threats to internal validity and look at this crackdown on speeders in the state of Connecticut. And you could say, well, why do that? What's so important about the crackdown on speeders in Connecticut? And I think it's a good example because the governor was actually one of these experimental administrators who was really interested in knowing whether his program was working or not. And Campbell and his colleagues had the opportunity to go in and actually evaluate that. So it was a good kind of synergy there between the elected officials and the researchers. So the simplest thing you could do is take the before and after. So in 1955, before the crackdown on speeders, there were 324 fatalities in the state of Connecticut. A year later, there were 284 fatalities. So it looks like Ribicoff's program's working pretty well. You know, he reduced traffic fatalities in, several people over that year. Now the problem with that is if we only take these two time points, before and after, we don't know what that graph or data looks like for the other years preceding and coming afterward. So we don't have a sense of the instability of the data to assess whether this decline is really significant or not. So the question is the drop in traffic fatalities due to a program effect or to regression toward the mean? Because he happened to pick a year when there were a lot of traffic fatalities in 1955. So to try to answer or to compensate for that problem when you're just using a couple of time points, you can expand out your before and after observations. They call this an extended time series design. So, basically you've got the observations before the treatment, the traffic crackdown on speeders, and you're looking at, over this period of time, what does that trend look like before and after the program? If you just look immediately before and after the treatment, like right here, you're going to have a harder time interpreting whether the program's having any effect or not. So this allows a clear interpretation of the effects of your treatment. So this is the extended time series data for the state of Connecticut in terms of traffic fatalities starting in 1951 to 59. And what you see here is that, very conveniently for the governor, he waited until a very extreme point in traffic fatalities before he implemented his program. So chances were the rate of fatalities was going to come down because of statistical regression, and his program was going to look pretty good. And you can see that the amount that it came down is not that different than the amount it came down in these years, 51 to 52 and 54 to 55. So we have to put that in perspective. Is this decline really a big effect of his program, or is it sort of an artifact that isn't really telling us what's going on? So the drop in traffic fatalities in 1955 and 56 may well be due to statistical regression. So that's what this graph suggests. So what do you do in a case like that? Yeah? Great. So you'd look at neighboring states like Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island. Because why would you do that? Why would you do that? What David's saying is you want to look at those neighboring states because they're all experiencing the same regional weather pattern. So if the weather was particularly dry that year, they all should be showing a decline in traffic fatalities. So this is called a control series design where you put your extended series together with some control comparison groups. In other words, the data from neighboring states. So is the drop due to weather? So that's another question that comes up, and that's why David is saying, well, let's look at some neighboring states to see what their weather was like and what their traffic fatality rates were like. So this is where you're adding a control group, a comparison group, and that's why it becomes a quasi-experimental design rather than just an observational study, because we're adding some comparison groups that didn't get the treatment in the neighboring states. So the treatment and control groups may not be equivalent, they're not randomly assigned, but at least it gives us some basis of comparison between Connecticut and those neighboring states. And also, we want to extend this out to more observations, right? We don't want just before and after, but we want that extended series. So we're going to compare the changes in those two groups. So here we're extending the number of observations over time. And this improves on the simple time series design because now we've got some comparison groups. And observations in the comparison condition reduce ambiguities that may be present in the treatment observation. So in this slide, we're seeing how that plays out. So you've got 1951 to 1959, and these are your control states, 4 control states that are neighboring, like New York and Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and this is Connecticut. And so you can see up until this point, they look kind of similar. So what's important here is that if you look at the trend line here for the neighboring states, their traffic fatality rate is kind of up, stays sort of the same. It goes down a little bit, but it stays the same. Whereas here, after the traffic crackdown on speeders in Connecticut, you see this continually declining graph. And this gap increases between the neighboring states and Connecticut. So the neighboring states had similar weather, so you can't say weather caused this. And you can't say it's just regression of the mean because you're extending over several different time points. But it's this comparative gap in the data for those neighboring states versus Connecticut that gives you some credence that the program was in fact effective. So, I hope that all of you feel like you've learned some useful things in this course. As I said on the very first day, I didn't expect that everything we covered was going to be scintillating and exciting for you. But I hope that some of the tidbits work and that you can take them with you and apply them in your future careers. And I also hope that we had some fun. I hope you enjoy the class, and at least we heard some good music, right? So, one of the things that strikes me about today, and I think back to when I was in college in the 60s, and we had a very polarized country torn apart by the Vietnam War. And I think today we have a similar situation where we have extreme ideological and political polarization in this country. And there's a real need for kind of putting things back together, finding some common ground. And, sometimes when I get discouraged about the budget situation in California and cutbacks to public education, including the University of California, one thing that really encourages me and makes me feel pretty good is that I feel like I have one of the best jobs around because I get to come in and have the privilege of working with students like yourselves who are bright, energetic, you want to go out and do good things in the world, and that really is a true privilege. So I just want to say I think that's certainly one of the most important things that we as professors do. I feel that way about what I do at UCI. I think that in thinking about all of you as a group this quarter, you were a pleasure to work with. And, I had said early on in the first class that I really expected everybody to be respectful of each other and the course team, and I really feel that you showed that respect. And I hope that we did toward you as well. And some of you showed extreme altruism when Hiroshi put up that message board before the midterm exam. I saw a lot of instances where people were helping each other out and providing information to people who were strangers to them. And I think that bodes well, because we have a very diverse class. We have a class made up of all different religions, ethnicities. Some of you are from different countries. And yet you all kind of pull together, and we're a pretty cohesive group, at least from my point of view. So I thank you for that. It's been a true pleasure for me. One of the things I hope is that as you go on and do great things, that you keep in touch with us and let us know what you're doing. One of my former students who took the course in the early 70s, got his BA in social ecology in 1976, came back to UCI this year and gave a TED Talk. His name is Rocky Roeder, and he's a professor and former chair of the Department of Environmental Studies and Planning at Sonoma State University. So many of you are going to go on to do great things, whether it's in environmental psychology or planning or some other walk of life. So do stay in touch with us. Let us know how you're doing. And again, it's been a true pleasure working with you all, so thank you very much.